Every single one of you watching this right now has a bag somewhere in your sewing room. Maybe it is under the table, maybe it is stuffed in a closet, maybe you have 3 of them. And inside those bags are quilt scraps. Strips, triangles, wonky little pieces you trimmed off a block and thought, I will use that someday. But someday never comes, does it? Instead, the bag gets bigger. You add more to it. You feel guilty every time you walk past it. And then one day, you just throw the whole thing away because it feels like chaos you cannot control. Right now. Because I am going to walk you through 7 specific ways to reuse those scraps. And at least 3 of them are going to change how you think about waste in your sewing room forever. The first method is something so simple you might overlook it, but it will immediately improve your sewing on every single project you touch from now on. You need leaders. If you have been sewing without a leader piece at your machine, I need you to start today because it is going to solve a problem you might not even realize you have. Here is what happens when you start sewing without a leader. You put your fabric under the presser foot, you hit the pedal, and the machine grabs the thread and the first few stitches pull your fabric down into the throat plate. You get a tangle underneath, a thread nest. The bobbin thread wraps around itself, the top thread gets sucked down, and now you have a knot on the underside of your work right at the start of the seam. Sometimes it jams the machine. Sometimes it just leaves an ugly clump that you have to pick out. Either way, it is frustrating and it is completely avoidable. A leader is just a small folded piece of fabric that you keep right next to your machine, and you sew through it before you start your actual work. You run a few stitches through the leader, then butt your real fabric right up against it and keep sewing. The leader absorbs that initial tension. Any thread nest that would have happened on your good fabric happens on the leader instead. And when you are done with your seam, you can sew through another leader at the end as an ender, which keeps the thread tidy and gives you a clean starting point for your next piece. This is where your crumbs come in perfectly. Leaders do not need to be square. They do not need to be uniform. They do not need to be pretty. A crumb that is 1.5 inches by 2 inches, folded in half, is a perfect leader. That weird triangle you trimmed off a block 10 minutes ago works great. You can use the same leaders over and over until they are so full of stitch lines they start to fall apart. And then you grab another crumb from the pile. But here is the part that people miss about leaders. They are not just thread nest prevention. They also give your fabric something to press against as it first contacts the feed dogs. When your fabric hits those feed dogs with nothing in front of it, the front edge can drift or get pushed sideways, especially on small pieces. But when there is a leader right in front of it, acting like a little bumper, your fabric feeds in straight and stable. It is a tiny thing that makes a genuine difference in seam accuracy, especially when you are chain piecing small units. And since we are talking about crumbs today, everything you sew with these methods is going to be small, so having that leader in place matters even more. Keep a little container of crumbs right next to your machine specifically for leaders. A small bowl, a cup, a jar, whatever. You want them within arm's reach, so you never have an excuse to start sewing without one. Method number 2 is crumb chains, and this is where you start actually turning those tiny pieces into usable fabric. The concept is straightforward. You take 2 crumbs that are roughly similar in size and you sew them together along one edge. Then you take another pair and sew those together, and another. You chain piece them, meaning you feed one pair after another through the machine without cutting the thread in between. You end up with a connected chain of little sewn pairs. Then you take those pairs and sew pairs to pairs, and then you sew those units to other units. You keep building and building, and what started as a pile of random tiny scraps becomes usable strips of fabric. These strips are not going to be perfectly even. They are going to have variation in width, and the seams will not line up in any regular pattern. And that is completely fine. That is the character of crumb work. The strips you make this way can go into all kinds of blocks. They work beautifully in designs like coin quilts, where you stack short strips into columns. They work in log cabin blocks, where you can use a crumb strip as one of the logs. They work anywhere you need a strip of fabric, and do not care if it has seams running through it. The key with crumb chains is to sew like sizes together first. Do not try to sew a tiny triangle to a long skinny strip in your first pass. Start with pieces that are close to the same height or width, so the seams are manageable and the units stay relatively flat. You can mix shapes as you get into the second and third rounds of joining, because by then the units are bigger and easier to handle. And do not forget to press. I know it is tempting to just keep feeding pieces through the machine and deal with pressing later. But with crumbs, you really need to press frequently because the seams are short and close together. And if you let them stack up without pressing, the block gets bulky and warped and will not lie flat. You do not have to press after every single seam, but every 2 or 3 additions, take it to the iron. Press those seams to one side and then keep going. Your finished strips and blocks will be so much better for it. Method number 3 builds directly on what you just learned with crumb chains. It takes it further. Instead of making strips, you are going to make crumb blocks, full squares or rectangles of fabric built entirely from scraps. There are 2 approaches here and they each have a different feel. The first approach is structured. You take the crumb chains from method 2 and sew several of them together side by side to form a block. You end up with something that looks like a strip-pieced block, rows of random fabric sewn into a square. It has a visual rhythm to it because the strips create horizontal or vertical lines, even though the individual pieces within each strip are random. The second approach is organic. Instead of making strips first, you just start sewing crumbs directly to each other in whatever configuration makes sense based on their shapes. A triangle gets sewn to a rectangle. That unit gets sewn to a square. You let the block grow outward in whatever direction it wants to go, trimming in, squaring up as needed along the way. This produces blocks that look more like a mosaic or a collage, with seams running in, all directions and pieces of every shape and size fitting together. Either way, once your crumb block is the size you want, you can use it in 2 ways. You can use the block itself as a quilt block, setting it alongside other blocks in your quilt layout, or you can treat it as a piece of fabric and cut a new shape from it. You could cut a circle, a heart, a hexagon, whatever your pattern calls for, and the offcuts from that cutting do not get thrown away. They go right back into your crumb pile and become the foundation for your next block. Nothing is wasted. It just keeps cycling. Now, a lot of quilters like to sew their crumbs onto a foundation when building these blocks, and I understand why. A foundation, whether it is fabric or paper, gives you something stable to sew onto so your crumbs do not shift around as much. Some people use muslin, some people use old phone book pages. I am personally a fan of adding machine tape for strip-style crumb work because it comes in a consistent narrow width, and it is cheap. I picked up a box of rolls that were being thrown out from an office, and I have been working through them for ages. Just lay your crumbs along the tape, sew them down, and when the strip is done, you trim it to whatever width you need, with a 1/4-inch seam allowance on each side. The paper tears away easily along the stitch lines once the block is assembled. I usually work a few strips at a time so I can batch my pressing and not be running back and forth to the iron after every single seam. If you are building full blocks rather than strips on a foundation, paper works the same way. Cut or tear a piece of paper to your desired block size. Lay your first crumb right in the center and build outward. From there, the same way I described in the organic approach, sewing each new piece onto the previous one through both the fabric and the paper. The paper stabilizes everything and makes it much easier to get flat blocks, especially when your crumbs are very small and irregular. When the block is complete and sewn into whatever you are making, the paper tears out. Just make sure you use a slightly shorter stitch length than normal, around 1.5 to 1.8 on your machine, because the shorter stitches perforate the paper more thoroughly and make it release cleanly. If your stitches are too long, the paper tears in chunks instead of peeling away smoothly, and you end up picking tiny bits out with a seam ripper for way longer than you want. Method number 4 is crumb applique, and this is one of my favorites because It lets you use the very smallest scraps in a way that looks intentional and artistic. Here is how it works. You take a fusible web product, something like Steam A Seam or any similar double-sided fusible, and you iron your crumbs onto it. Specifically, you take your offcuts of fusible web, because if you do any kind of applique work, you already have scraps of fusible just like you have scraps of fabric, and you fuse your fabric crumbs to those fusible scraps. Now you have small pieces of fabric with an adhesive backing that can be stuck onto any background and pressed permanently into place with a hot iron. This opens up a whole range of possibilities. You can add crumb applique pieces to quilt blocks as design elements, little pops of color or texture in spots that need something extra. You can layer them onto a finished quilt top before quilting to add dimension. You can use them in art quilting where precision is not the goal, and the raw, layered look of overlapping small pieces creates its own beauty. But my absolute favorite use for crumb applique is postcards. Fabric postcards. This is a real thing that quilters make and actually send through the mail, and they are a fantastic way to use up tiny scraps while making something genuinely special for someone. Here is how I make mine. I keep a stack of cardstock, some batting scraps, and some pieces of fabric that are not attractive enough to use in a quilt. What I call my ugly fabric stash, on hand specifically for postcards. You layer your ugly fabric on the bottom, a piece of batting on top of that, and then your postcard background fabric on top. These layers should be just a little larger than your card stock. Then you arrange your crumb applique pieces on the background in whatever design you like and fuse them down with the iron. If you do not have fusible on your crumbs, a regular glue stick works fine for holding them in place. Then you quilt through all the layers however you want, straight lines, free motion, whatever feels right. After quilting, you glue your card stock to the back of the piece and trim everything to the same size as the card. For the final edge, you bind it with a tight zigzag stitch all the way around. I use a width around 4 millimeters and a very short stitch length about 0.75, which gives you a dense satin-like edge that seals everything together and looks clean. Trim your threads and it is done. You can address it, stamp it, and send it exactly like a regular postcard. I have sent dozens of these and people absolutely love receiving them. Each one takes maybe 20 minutes and costs essentially nothing because every component comes from scraps and leftovers you already had. That is the first 4 methods, and we are now at the halfway mark. Methods 5 through 7 are coming up next, and I want you to pay attention to number 7 especially because it connects to something I think every quilter needs to hear about the mental side of working with scraps. Stay with me. Here is chunk 2. Method number 5 is one I want to mention even though it is not something I personally do at my own machine, because I hear from quilters constantly who do this and love it. The concept is simple. You keep a large container beside your sewing table. A pillowcase works perfectly because it is soft and expandable, and you already have spare ones, and every single crumb and cutting goes into it. All the trimmings, all the tiny strips, all the weird bits you would normally sweep into the trash. Everything goes into the pillowcase. And when it is full, you sew it shut and donate it as a pet bed to your local animal shelter. I cannot tell you how many quilters have written to me about doing this. Shelters need bedding constantly. Dogs and cats in kennels need something soft and warm to lie on. And commercial pet beds are expensive for organizations running on tight budgets and donations. A pillowcase stuffed with cotton scraps is soft. It is washable. It is warm. And it is exactly the kind of thing shelters go through quickly because the bedding gets soiled and replaced on a regular cycle. So having a steady supply matters. If you are someone who produces a lot of scraps and you know that sewing with tiny pieces is not your thing, this is a meaningful way to make sure none of that fabric goes to waste. You are not throwing it away. You are giving it a second life. And it costs you nothing beyond the pillowcase and the 5 minutes it takes to sew it closed. The reason I mention this one specifically is because I never want anyone to feel pressured into saving and sewing with every last crumb if it does not bring them joy. Some quilters love crumb work. They find it relaxing, creative, meditative. Other quilters find it tedious and stressful, and the growing pile of tiny scraps makes them anxious rather than inspired. Both responses are completely valid. If working with crumbs is not for you, the best thing you can do is give them to someone who will use them, whether that is a shelter, a quilting friend who loves improv work, or a community group that takes fabric donations. The goal is not to save every scrap at all costs. The goal is to make sure your scraps have a destination, so they are not just sitting in a bag generating guilt. Method number 6 is using your crumbs to decorate and cover everyday objects. And this is genuinely fun in a way that feels different from regular quilting. You know those items around your house or your sewing space that are functional but not exactly beautiful. A plain container you use to catch thread tails at your machine, a foam board, a storage box, anything with a surface you can glue fabric to. You can cover these things with crumbs using a simple decoupage technique and turn them into something that is actually nice to look at and completely your own. The adhesive is simple. 2 parts regular craft glue to 1 part water mixed together. That gives you a thin, brushable consistency that goes on smooth and dries clear. Some people use actual Mod Podge and that works fine too. It is essentially the same thing just pre-mixed. You brush the glue mixture onto the surface of your object, lay your crumbs on, brush more glue over the top and let it dry. You can overlap pieces, you can leave small gaps, you can arrange them in patterns or go completely random. The fabric stiffens as the glue dries and becomes a permanent surface coating. I have covered containers that I use at my sewing table as thread catchers this way, and I use them every single day. They are functional and they look great, and they were made entirely from crumbs that would have been trash. This is also the kind of project you can do while doing something else. I have sat on video calls gluing crumbs onto containers because it requires almost no mental focus. Your hands are busy, but your brain is free. It is a perfect low-effort scrap activity for those days when you do not have the energy or the time for actual sewing, but you still want to feel like you accomplished something with your scraps. And because the pieces are so small and the technique is so forgiving, there is no precision required, no seam allowances, no matching, no pressing, just glue and fabric and whatever surface you want to make more interesting. It is a welcome change of pace from the precision that quilting usually demands. Now here is method number 7, and this is the one I want to spend the most time on because it is the one with the most creative potential and honestly, the most long-term value for your growth as a quilter. Method 7 is using your crumbs for improv quilting. And I realize that the line between crumb quilting and improv quilting is blurry. The crumb chains and crumb blocks I talked about in methods 2 and 3 could absolutely be considered improv. The crumb applique in method 4 has an improvisational quality to it. Everything kind of blurs together at a certain point, and that is actually the beauty of it. Improv is not a separate technique, as much as it is a mindset, a way of approaching your sewing where you let go of patterns and measurements and predetermined outcomes and just follow the fabric where it wants to go. The crumb chains you learn to make, those can become part of an improv quilt. The crumb blocks, whether structured or organic, can be set into an improv layout where nothing is the same size and the arrangement is driven by visual balance rather than a grid. Your crumb applique pieces can be scattered across an improv composition to add layers and focal points. Everything you have learned in this video feeds into improv if you want it to. And here is why I think this matters beyond just using up scraps. For a lot of quilters, especially those of us who are drawn to this craft because we like precision and order and following clear instructions, improv is genuinely therapeutic. I mean that. When you spend your days working through to-do lists, meeting deadlines, measuring twice, and cutting once, living in a world that demands accuracy and leaves little room for mistakes, sitting down at your sewing machine with a pile of crumbs And no plan is like giving your brain permission to rest. Part of your mind that is always calculating and organizing and checking, gets to take a break. And the other part, the part that notices color and feels texture and has opinions about what looks beautiful, that part gets to take over for a while. It is like stretching after sitting at a desk all day. It is relief. I have talked to hundreds of quilters over the years who told me they were afraid of improv. They thought they would be bad at it. They thought their results would look like a mess. And some of them tried it and their first blocks were not great, and that is normal. But they kept going. And what happened was they started developing an eye for color and composition that made their precise quilting better too. Because improv teaches you to see the relationships between fabrics. It teaches you that a dark piece next to a light piece creates energy. It teaches you that scale matters and contrast matters, and that sometimes the most interesting part of a quilt is the unexpected choice. Piece that should not work but does because it is in the right spot. You cannot learn those things from a pattern. You learn them from playing. And crumbs are the lowest stakes material to play with because they cost you nothing and they were headed for the trash anyway. I want to give you one more piece of practical advice that applies to all 7 methods and especially to methods 2, 3, and 7. Your pressing technique with crumbs matters more than you think. Because the pieces are small and the seams are close together, poor pressing shows up faster and more obviously with crumb work than with regular piecing. If your seams are not pressed properly, your block will not lie flat. It will be lumpy and wavy, and it will fight you when you try to square it up or sew it to something else. So here is what I want you to remember. Press, do not iron. There is a difference. When you press, you lift the iron. Set it down on the seam, apply pressure, lift it back up and move to the next spot. When you iron, you slide the iron back and forth across the fabric like you are getting wrinkles out of a shirt. Sliding causes the fabric to stretch and distort, especially small pieces with a lot of seam bulk. You want downward pressure, not side-to-side movement. Set the iron down, press firmly for 2 or 3 seconds, lift it, move it. That is how you get crumb blocks that lie perfectly flat and behave when you put them into your projects. And I know that some of you watching this are thinking that all of this sounds like a lot of work for very small pieces of fabric. I understand that reaction. I really do. And I want you to know that there is absolutely no rule that says you have to use your crumbs. If working with tiny scraps gives you stress instead of satisfaction, then do not do it. Put them in a paper bag and donate them to someone who will enjoy them. There are quilters, guild members, community groups, and art teachers who would be thrilled to have a bag of small fabric pieces. The goal of this video is not to make you feel guilty about what you throw away. The goal is to show you that if you do want to use those pieces, there are real, practical, enjoyable ways to do it. And maybe 1 or 2 of these methods will click with you and become part of your regular routine, and the rest you can leave behind. Let me walk through all 7 one more time so you have them clearly. Number 1. Leaders and enders. Using your crumbs as the small fabric pieces you sew through at the start and end of every seam to prevent thread nests and improve feed accuracy. Number 2. Crumb chains. Sewing small pieces into pairs and then into strips that can be used in a wide variety of block designs. Number 3. Crumb blocks. Building full squares or rectangles from scraps either in organized strips or grown organically, optionally on a paper foundation like adding machine tape. Number 4. Crumb applique using fusible web to turn your smallest pieces into design elements for blocks, quilts, and fabric postcards. Number 5. Stuffing donations. Filling a pillowcase with scraps and donating it as a pet bed to a local shelter. Number 6. Decoupage. Covering household objects and sewing room accessories with crumbs using diluted craft glue for functional and decorative results. And number 7. Improv quilting. Using all of the previous methods as building blocks for free-form, unstructured quilt compositions that stretch your creative muscles and give your analytical brain a rest. Every one of these methods takes what you were going to throw away and turns it into something with purpose. Some of those purposes are practical, some are artistic, some are charitable, but all of them are better than a garbage bag. Your crumbs earned their place in your sewing room. You chose those fabrics, you paid for them, you cut them with intention. The fact that the leftover pieces are small does not mean they are worthless. It just means they are waiting for the right project. And now you have 7 projects to choose from. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.